ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, U.S. Army retired, a Fox News military analyst, author of the new book, Preparing for World War III, a global conflict that redefines tomorrow. And Bob Maginnis, thanks for joining us on the Schilling Show Unleashed.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
On the concept of World War III, I've been hearing for a while that we've been in World War III. It's just a Cold War, and I'd love to start there. Is that the case?
I think so. I wrote a book in 2018, Alliance of Evil, talking about the 16 indicators of a new Cold War. And, of course, everybody remembers the Cold War of 1948 to 1991 with the Soviets and all that was involved in that. And if you look across the landscape of the geopolitical situation in the world today, you see those same very indicators, the spine, the competition militarily, economic, the alliance lineup and so forth. Everything is there in spades, Rob. And what we are seeing more recently, of course, are statements coming out of the mouths of our adversaries, the Chinese, President Xi and President Putin. And it seems to paint a picture that they're already engaged in going after us in terms of using a variety of weapons. Arguably, they're more subtle, such as cyber, such as psychological involvement in our elections. And, of course, I would argue pushing fentanyl into the United States is something that the Chinese have been doing vis-a-vis the cartels in Mexico. So there are a host of things. Now, having said that, recognize that the statements by some of the leaders in the world, not only Xi and Putin, but also the new president, President Trump, as well as other luminaries such as Elon Musk and so forth, have said, yeah, we are in a new war. Now, it's not yet truly a shooting war, although we do have fighting going on in eastern Ukraine, as well as ongoing tensions in the Middle East and the real prospect of something breaking out in Asia. So there's a lot going on to suggest that we're moving in that direction to something more than just the subtleties of the old Cold War.
Bob, you mentioned the parallels. What's the primary difference between then and now?
I would argue that we had, at that point in the Soviet Union days, we had one primary global adversary, the Soviet Union, and their ideology. Today, we have a mixed bag of adversaries. Clearly, the Chinese have the largest military in the world, and that exceeds ours in a variety of areas. But they also have the alliance or allegiance of the Russians, which aren't what they used to be. But then there's a growing cadre of countries that are really dissatisfied with the Western world order. And therefore, you've seen the likes of BRICS and other organizations that have been spun up to align themselves with the totalitarians like President Xi. And they're using international activities such as Belt and Road Initiative to, push and foist their geopolitical interest. And so we're beginning to see cracks in the international order that we've so come to appreciate here in the West, because part of the world, a growing part of this world, to include the Brazilians and the Indians and so forth, aren't really satisfied with the way things are going. So that, I think, is a contributor on the underside, but there's an ideology, obviously, by the communists that are pushing that in a very aggressive way. And so we have to be very, very careful about going forward.
It appears we have a facade of a very strong American military, yet there are a lot of problems beneath that. And I'd like to first talk about the manpower aspect of the military and also the recruitment problems we're facing today, which I think are underplayed.
Oh, they are indeed. It's not just what Mr. Trump has said, the DEI agenda, certainly the lack of seriousness about building readiness, but we've underspent and underinvested, and then in many areas. Our Army is, I would argue, marginal, only capable of fighting one region war if necessary, and our equipment is aging and our modernization is slow. The Navy is very weak because we have not kept up a shipbuilding routine as outlined, certainly in preparing for World War III. I have an entire appendix that shows side by side what the U.S. has, what the Russians have, and what the Chinese have. And when you combine the Chinese and the Russian fleets, as well as their air forces, as well as their space and nuclear capabilities, you come to a very quick conclusion that, we are outgunned. Now, we do have an edge in certain technologies, but that's rapidly being replaced because the Chinese have been very good at stealing our technologies. So we're at a critical time, I would argue, and one that has broad implications for the future of the world.
Bob, if we can't recruit people to join the military, and maybe that will turn around under Trump, but if we're not able to do that, what do we do as a nation?
Well, we have to revert back to conscription, to the draft. And of course, that ended in 1973 with the all-volunteer force. And we've been able to recruit sufficient numbers of personnel for the most part. There have been some downturns up until the present time. And unfortunately, Rob, large demographic in this country, those that are most eligible to serve in the armed forces, there are reasons why we can't or won't recruit them. In some cases, it's because of physical conditions, too fat, not in good condition physically for physical activities, but also for their behavior issues, drug use, and criminal background. So when you slice up the demographic of those, let's say, 18 to 25, you find that there's a cohort that everybody wants, to include the military, and unfortunately a lot of kids aren't deciding that the military is their future. And so we end up not having a very large group of people from which to recruit, and it's becoming incredibly expensive for the American taxpayer to recruit those that we do recruit. And one of the reasons why certainly the totalitarian nations of the world have large militaries and have some good talent there is because they conscript. They just mandate, you're going to come in and then you can serve your time and you can leave. Well, we don't have that luxury at this point. And so this is coming, though it's a very unpopular political issue, it's something that's on the horizon, I believe.
You mentioned the technology, and I wanted to talk about our hardware and our technology. Particularly, do we go forward with the next generation of fighter jets, or do we go more towards unmanned? And in the Navy, do we have threats that we can't meet regarding hypersonic missiles and vulnerability of our ships?
Yes to all of that. Autonomous battlefield is something that's here, and we've seen this in spades, certainly in Ukraine, where literally on any given day in the battle, there are small and large drones, unmanned aerial vehicles that are delivering munitions or crashing into tanks or destroying power stations and airfields in Russia. So we have that. We certainly have the cyber issue, which, of course, a modern military relies upon its computers. And so there are a lot of, quote, cyber bullets being fired, by the millions on at any given second across the battlefield. And so that's a new thing. Information battlefield is very critical. Everybody has access to satellite imagery, and so they know at any given time where the enemy is. And as a result, that plus electronic warfare and other mechanisms that we have for spying on an enemy really makes it hard to hide and makes it hard to find surprise when we're trying to execute a particular mission against an enemy. So you have those things. The modern tech stuff is critical to understand. Much of it has not hit the open press. We have directed energy weapons that have been experimented. We've used some in the Red Sea from the Navy against things being shot by the Houthis, mostly drones, but we have other technologies that are emerging. We can destroy something from hundreds of miles away using hypersonics. Now, we do have hypersonics we're developing. We haven't fielded them yet, but the Chinese and the Russians claim, of course, that they have, and especially the Russians against the Ukrainians. There are a number of very significant reports in that regard. We're talking stealth destroyers, stealth tanks, super soldier systems that, exoskeleton of sorts that make certain soldiers incredibly fast, much stronger than the normal human being. So there's a lot on the horizon here, Rob, that we need to recognize that the battlefield is being redefined in a way that is quite frightening. It's not quite Star Wars, but it's trending in that direction.
One of the things that is talked about frequently, as you referenced, Bob, is the Chinese stealing, in particular, our technology. I remember seeing their stealth fighter plane, which looked like a carbon copy of ours. But this goes back so much further. I remember the Russian space shuttle that was an abject failure, but it looked like it was a carbon copy of ours, at least on the surface. So are we vulnerable no matter what we do, or are we just not doing enough?
Well, I would argue we aren't doing enough in keeping things in an open society necessarily secret. Though we have the DARPAs of the world, which do all the research and production of these sensitive weapons and intelligence gathering mechanisms within the Pentagon, but we do it through universities, through science foundations and the like. And then, of course, the Chinese have been incredibly effective by infiltrating students, researchers that work hand in glove with our people, and then take all of that technology back to China. So it's no coincidence that much of what we see coming off the assembly lines in Beijing and the like are very similar to what we're first manufacturing in this country. And they, unfortunately, have a production and a military industrial complex that is much, much larger than our own. And so they're making things that really came out of designs and technology and science here much faster than we are. And of course, they can do it cheaper because of the cost of living and a variety of other factors.
Before we go to World War III, I would like to talk about the lessons that we learned or maybe didn't learn from World War I and World War II.
World War I, we didn't take the fight to the Germans. And as a result, the German population didn't suffer, didn't feel the pain of war. And, of course, Eisenhower reversed that after the Normandy invasion in 1944, and we took the fight directly to Berlin, and as a result, that worked to our favor going forward. Now, appeasement was a serious problem then, and it's a serious problem today. Appeasement, of course, allowed Adolf Hitler, prior to World War II, to take Austria, Czechoslovakia, to intimidate much of Western Europe, and then eventually to invade on September the 1st, 1939, into Poland unopposed except by the Polish. And of course, that triggered the Brits and the French and others to eventually come into the fight. The likes of Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who, after meeting with the Italians and the Germans in Munich in 1938, came back and declared, there's peace as our time. Well, he was so naive, he didn't understand our adversaries. Our adversaries, by today's standards are very, very serious. President Xi has made it very clear that he has every intention of making the Middle Kingdom, ostensibly the Chinese government, the communist version of it, the world leader once again, economically, geopolitically, and the like. And certainly all of his efforts, whether through Belt and Road Initiative or the Arctic Agenda and so forth, and of course his aggressiveness, spine, and of course using his economy as best as he can, although they do have challenges today, has been incredibly effective across the world. And we have not responded. We've actually, much like Chamberlain, been appeasing for so many years. From the time of Nixon to the time of Biden here recently, we've just caved and turned a blind eye to what is clearly a very serious agenda to transform the world into something more like in Beijing than it is about Washington.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis in just a moment.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit ShillingShowMedia.com. That's ShillingShowMedia.com.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
We continue now on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. The new book is Preparing for World War III, A Global Conflict That Redefines Tomorrow with Bob Maginnis. So let's talk about World War III. Is this going to be an Allied versus Axis in the way it was in World War II, or are the lines going to be more fuzzy?
Well, that's a fair question, and it's hard to tell at this point. There's no question that the Chinese and the Russians are lining up an alliance system, an alternative to the current world order that is more suitable to their liking. I mentioned in the last program BRICS and other types of organizations in which the Chinese are recruiting like-minded totalitarians to their side. So that's significant. And of course, the U.S. already has in place a host of allies and partners. You think of NATO as being one of 31, 32 nations currently engaged in operations, of course, helping the Ukrainians in Europe. It would appear as if you kind of have an alignment that is similar to what we saw in World War II, in that there's a West and there's an East. Or there's, certainly one that's aligned with China, which would be the big dog in that future fight. But there are others that are less clear. There are a lot of South American countries that are trending toward China. There are a lot of African countries because of financial engagements trending toward China. And, of course, a lot of Middle Eastern countries, which are somewhat confused by what's going on today with the Iranians and the Israelis and the like. And so you do have that real possibility, Rob. It's, I think, a bit too early to say that it's going to be very well defined. It's not necessarily that I don't think will be the case, but it could be.
Based on our previous conversation, Bob, it sounds like we're ill-prepared for World War III, at least militarily. But what are the other areas that we should be preparing for in anticipating World War III?
Our defense industrial base is on its back. We saw that in spades when we tried to gift arguably $200 billion to the Ukrainian war cause in helping Kyiv to resist the Russians. We in many cases have almost emptied some of our arsenals, are arguably jeopardizing our own security going forward. So if we want an industrial base that can do something similar to what FDR did during World War II or the lead up of World War II, we're going to have to, really start back at square one. We don't have the legal authority to go out and force, the Ford Motor Companies of the world to make tanks, or the Boeings to make jet fighters at a quicker pace than we do before, much less tanks and other things. So we just don't have that. And arguably, Rob, I would say the American people are not terribly resilient. We tend to be rather soft. You take away our cell phones and our internet, our hot and cold running water, plenty of food, and our social media, of course, and we tend to be very irritable. And as a result, we are not terribly unified as a country at this point. Juxtapose that with what we faced, leading up to World War II, and I think after the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 41, we were a unified country. And of course, we were a unified country after the 9/11 attacks, but it didn't last that long. And today we find we're a divided people, and so we don't have, I would say, the resilience, the stamina that a country needs if we are, in fact, facing a very serious external threat. And I would argue that the threat of a World War III, much like we took the fight to the German population and bombed the Berlins and the Dresdens and so forth, the future war will probably impact the civilian population, because we're going to have our critical infrastructure, which is already contaminated with malware from the Chinese, that's going to be terminated, or if not seriously damaged. And so that's going to cause widespread discomfort, if not outright panic. Now, do I expect that we'll have invading forces in this country at some future point? I don't know. I would hope not, but that's not totally out of the question either. We are not the nation that we need to be in terms of the might. And I, of course, go into great detail as to how we've weakened our military. I'm hopeful that Mr. Trump and a supportive Congress can focus on warfighting, focus on building up our capabilities to include our defense industrial base, and really preparing us for a very, very challenging future.
So you mentioned the possibility, Bob, of a foreign army invading us. What is the possibility that they're already here, having come across the border in significant numbers to do tremendous damage to the United States, and they're just lying low until the time they're called?
Well, certainly there's speculation that the tens of thousands of Chinese nationals that have infiltrated through our southern border, perhaps some from the northern border, are organized in cells and waiting for orders from Beijing. I don't know that. That is a real possibility. I would argue in the irregular war philosophy, the doctrine that the Chinese have been using against the U.S. since the time of Mao Zedong in late 1940s, that we find that here in the United States, we're just ignorant to how we've been manipulated, not only economically by the Chinese, but also they've infiltrated us through our own education systems by our choice, our own manufacturing and intellectual development, especially military systems. The whole fentanyl issue, which I mentioned earlier, I would argue is a payback for the 1860s heroin epidemic in China, which was foisted by the Brits and the French at the expense of the Chinese, so that they could get a stronghold on the Chinese economy. And so they're taking it down on the West, and the U.S. being the obvious choice. So when you put all that together, irregular warfare, which is a ongoing idea that uses all the activities and powers of government, and I'm talking about the Chinese government, to seek the ends in which places the Chinese government of the Chinese Communist Party at the lead of the world, believe it or not, those are statements that when President Xi speaks to his own cadre are well documented. And unfortunately, that's not often reported in the United States. I wrote a book a few years ago, Kings of the East, to really expose what the Chinese communists are all about and how they fit in the history of that 3,000-year-old country. So there's a lot that's going on here that we ought to be very concerned about. I know that there are people in Washington that are paying attention. I just hope it's not too late.
We should go now and finally to World War III and prophetic end times. How do these things work together, and what could we anticipate based on what the Bible says?
Well, the Bible's very clear that there's going to be a war at the end times. What I don't know, Rob, is whether or not the war that I'm speaking of, World War III, is that end times war. After all, World War I and World War II, I find no trace in God's Word. And so it could be that we have multiple future world wars before we get to that final war, which is spoken of mostly in Revelation. The other issue here, and I think this is important, is that there are people out there that like to interpret God's Word to say that our adversaries are, in the final days, will be China and Russia. And that's interesting speculation, but I don't know that that's necessarily the case. It's certainly rather speculative that China and Russia are going to be the end times adversaries. They in fact may diminish and be replaced by other countries. I think that that's a dangerous practice to come to those conclusions, though we can speculate. And so I see that what we're facing today is clearly very serious threats against our way of life. Mostly these pagan governments, these communist totalitarians don't like especially Christians, and we've seen the persecution not only by the Russians in Ukraine against especially evangelicals and non-Russian Orthodox churches, but the same thing is played out decisively in China, not only against Christians, but against the Uyghurs, against any religious group, even the Falun Gong. So you have to recognize that there is that whole tension, ideological tension, as well as the speculation on our part that somehow the Bible is a paranormal event and God zapped these people to write about these hidden adversaries, which they believe to be Russia and China. I don't know that that's true, but it's interesting speculation.
Bob Maginnis, if people would like to get a copy of the new book, Preparing for World War III, or if they'd like to follow your efforts online, tell us how, please.
Well, Preparing for World War III is, of course, available on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, Walmart, Target, just about anywhere in the world that sells books. It's widely available, as well as the 11 other books I've written. And, of course, I'm on Facebook. I write a lot of articles for other publications, and so it's easy to find me on the web, Maginnis. I'm pretty prolific and have been for many years.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, you've done a terrific job in laying out the case for getting prepared for World War III. Thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Rob.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.